chapter, sir. I need your license and registration. Judge Blackwood, have you had anything to drink tonight?
You know who I am. Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be.
I still need you to step out for a sobriety test.
Make life very difficult for y'all.
The dashboard camera started recording at exactly 11:42 p.m. on a quiet Tuesday evening. What began as a routine traffic stop on Highway 35 would soon become one of the most shocking encounters in law enforcement history, exposing a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of the justice system and ultimately resulted in a settlement so massive it would shake the foundations of an entire county. Officer Marcus Thompson had been patrolling the same stretch of highway for 7 years. He knew every curve, every speed trap, and every hiding spot where drivers thought they could get away with breaking the law. That night, he noticed a black luxury sedan weaving slightly between lanes, traveling just over the speed limit. Nothing too dramatic, but enough to warrant a stop. He flipped on his lights and pulled the vehicle over near mile marker 23. What Officer Thompson didn't know was that the man behind the wheel was Judge Richard Blackwood, a 8-year-old circuit court judge who had been presiding over cases in the county for over 2 decades. Judge Blackwood was known for his harsh sentences, his zero-tolerance policies, and his reputation for being tough on crime. He was also someone who believed the rules applied to everyone except himself. As Thompson approached the vehicle, his body camera captured every detail. The driver's window rolled down slowly, and Thompson could immediately smell alcohol. The man behind the wheel was well-dressed, wearing an expensive suit even at this late hour, and his eyes were bloodshot. Thompson asked for the standard documents: license, registration, and insurance. The driver handed over his license, and Thompson's expression changed slightly when he saw the name Judge Richard Blackwood. Thompson had appeared in this man's courtroom numerous times over the years, testifying in cases where Judge Blackwood had handed down sentences that sometimes seemed unusually harsh. But tonight, the judge was just another citizen who appeared to be driving under the influence. Thompson returned to his patrol car to run the license and registration. What he found in the system would later become crucial evidence. Judge Blackwood had 3 previous incidents on his record that had mysteriously been dismissed or reduced to minor infractions. 2 DUI charges from different counties had somehow disappeared from his record, and a reckless driving charge had been reduced to a simple speeding ticket. Someone had been protecting the judge, and that protection was about to run out. When Thompson returned to the vehicle, Judge Blackwood immediately tried to assert his authority. He told the officer that he was a sitting judge and that this stop was unnecessary. He suggested that Thompson should let him call someone to pick him up, rather than going through with any formal procedures. Thompson remained professional and explained that he needed to conduct field sobriety tests because he suspected the judge had been drinking. Judge Blackwood refused the tests. He became increasingly agitated and started making veiled threats about Thompson's career. He mentioned how officers who didn't show proper respect in his courtroom sometimes found their cases dismissed on technicalities. He talked about how he remembered faces and how cooperation worked both ways in their county's justice system. Thompson remained calm throughout this exchange. He had dealt with intimidation before, but never from someone in such a position of power. He continued following proper procedure and informed Judge Blackwood that refusing the sobriety tests would result in an automatic license suspension and arrest for DUI. The judge's response was both shocking and revealing. Judge Blackwood pulled out his cell phone and started making calls. First, he called the county sheriff, speaking to him by his first name and demanding immediate intervention. When that call didn't produce the results he wanted, he called the district attorney's office, leaving a voicemail that would later be used as evidence of attempted corruption. Finally, he called someone he referred to only as his contact at the state level. All of these conversations were recorded by Thompson's body camera. In each call, Judge Blackwood made it clear that he expected his position to protect him from consequences. He talked about favors owed and future considerations. He mentioned specific cases where he had helped certain people avoid serious charges. Most damaging of all, he referenced a network of officials who had an understanding about protecting each other from exactly these kinds of situations. Thompson continued with the arrest procedure. He called for backup and a supervisor to ensure everything was handled by the book. When backup arrived, Judge Blackwood's attitude shifted dramatically. He began offering bribes directly, first suggesting that Thompson might benefit from favorable treatment in future court appearances, then escalating to promises of career advancement, and finally to outright cash offers. Officer Sarah Martinez arrived as backup, and her camera captured Judge Blackwood attempting to bribe both officers. He pulled out an envelope from his briefcase that contained what appeared to be several $100s in cash. He told both officers that this was just a token of appreciation for their discretion, and that much more significant rewards awaited if they simply forgot about this incident. Both officers refused, and Thompson placed Judge Blackwood under arrest for DUI, attempted bribery of a police officer, and abuse of his official position. As they put him in handcuffs, the judge made his final mistake. He started naming names, threatening to expose what he called a system of mutual protection that involved judges, prosecutors, police chiefs, and elected officials throughout the region. The arrest footage showed Judge Blackwood in the back of the patrol car, making phone call after phone call to people he believed would intervene on his behalf. Each conversation revealed more details about corrupt practices, case fixing, and a network of officials who had been protecting each other for years. He was essentially confessing to a massive conspiracy while being recorded. At the station, Judge Blackwood's behavior became even more erratic. During processing, he continued attempting to bribe officers and jail staff. He offered to dismiss pending cases, reduce sentences for family members of officers, and provide favorable rulings in exchange for his release. Every offer was recorded, creating an extensive catalog of attempted corruption. The breathalyzer test showed Judge Blackwood's blood alcohol level at nearly twice the legal limit. Combined with his refusal to submit to field sobriety tests and his multiple attempts at bribery, the case against him was ironclad. But this was just the beginning of what would become a massive investigation into judicial corruption. Word of the arrest spread quickly through the courthouse. By morning, several attorneys came forward with stories about cases where Judge Blackwood had demanded unusual considerations in exchange for favorable rulings. Court clerks reported instances where the judge had altered records or made special accommodations for certain defendants. Prosecutors admitted to receiving pressure to modify charges based on the judge's relationships with various individuals. The state attorney general's office took over the investigation within 48 hours. They discovered a pattern of behavior stretching back over a decade. Judge Blackwood had been selling justice, literally putting price tags on sentences and verdicts. Wealthy defendants received probation, while poor defendants with similar charges went to prison. Political allies saw their cases dismissed, while ordinary citizens faced the full weight of the law. The investigation expanded beyond Judge Blackwood himself. The phone calls he made during his arrest had provided a roadmap to a network of corrupt officials throughout the county. Federal investigators got involved when they realized the scope of the conspiracy crossed state lines and potentially violated federal racketeering statutes. What started as a simple traffic stop had uncovered the largest judicial corruption scandal in the state's history. And Officer Marcus Thompson, who had simply been doing his job that Tuesday night, was about to become the key witness in a case that would transform an entire justice system. But the real shock was still to come when the financial settlements began rolling in. Settlements began rolling in. The investigation team that descended on the county courthouse looked like something out of a federal crime drama. FBI agents, state investigators, internal affairs officers, and forensic accountants all working together to unravel what would become known as the Blackwood Conspiracy. They set up a command center in an unused courtroom, filling it with boxes of evidence, computer terminals, and whiteboards covered in names and connections. Officer Thompson found himself at the center of this massive investigation. His body camera footage from that night became the cornerstone of the entire case. Federal prosecutors told him it was the most comprehensive evidence of judicial corruption they had ever seen, captured in real time with perfect audio and video quality. Every bribe attempt, every threat, every phone call had been recorded in stunning detail. Within 2 weeks of Judge Blackwood's arrest, the first wave of additional arrests began. The sheriff who had received that late-night phone call was charged with conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Phone records showed he had immediately called 3 other officials after speaking with the judge, warning them about the situation and discussing how to contain it. The district attorney's office faced a complete upheaval when investigators discovered that Judge Blackwood's voicemail from that night wasn't the first time he had contacted them about fixing cases. Email records going back 5 years showed regular communication between the judge and senior prosecutors about specific defendants who needed special treatment. Money had changed hands, political favors had been traded, and justice had been bought and sold like any other commodity. Court records became crucial evidence as investigators worked backwards through thousands of cases. They found patterns that were impossible to ignore. Defendants represented by certain law firms consistently received lighter sentences than similar cases. Wealthy individuals with no prior criminal history somehow received probation for serious felonies, while first-time offenders from poor neighborhoods went to prison for minor infractions. One case that particularly shocked investigators involved a drunk driving incident where a prominent businessman had killed a family of 3. Judge Blackwood had accepted a plea deal that resulted in just 18 months in minimum security prison and a fine that amounted to pocket change for the defendant. The family survivors had never understood why justice seemed so hollow until investigators showed them the financial records, proving that substantial payments had been made to ensure that light sentence. The forensic accountants discovered Judge Blackwood's corruption went far beyond simple bribery. He had been operating what essentially amounted to a criminal enterprise from his courtroom. Bank records showed deposits that coincided perfectly with controversial rulings. Expensive gifts appeared in his possession right after major cases were decided in unexpected ways. He had been living far beyond what his judicial salary could support, funding a lifestyle that included luxury cars, expensive vacations, and a mansion that cost more than he could legally afford. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was how systematic the corruption had become. Judge Blackwood kept detailed records of his illegal activities, apparently believing his position made him untouchable. Investigators found notebooks listing defendants, the amounts paid for favorable treatment, and even a rating system for how much different types of cases were worth. Murder cases commanded the highest prices, followed by major financial crimes, while drug offenses and theft charges had standardized rates. The ripple effects spread throughout the legal community as attorneys came forward with their own experiences. Some admitted to participating in the corruption, paying bribes to ensure their clients received favorable treatment. Others revealed they had been threatened or pressured to participate in the scheme. Several lawyers described being told their clients would face harsher sentences if they didn't play along with the judge's demands. Public defenders were particularly affected by these revelations. Many of their clients had received disproportionately harsh sentences, not because of the severity of their crimes, but because they couldn't afford to pay for better treatment. Families who had watched their loved ones disappear into the prison system for years suddenly understood why justice had seemed so unfair, why their pleas for mercy had fallen on deaf ears. The psychological impact on Officer Thompson was significant. He had testified in Judge Blackwood's courtroom dozens of times over the years, watching as the judge handed down sentences that sometimes seemed excessive. Now he understood that those harsh sentences weren't about justice or deterrence. They were about maintaining the judge's reputation for being tough, while the real money-making cases received secret special treatment. Media attention intensified as more details emerged. Television news crews camped outside the courthouse, interviewing anyone willing to speak about their experiences with Judge Blackwood. Former defendants and their families shared stories of sentences that had never made sense, of watching wealthy defendants walk free while they or their loved ones faced years in prison for lesser crimes. The State Bar Association launched its own investigation into every attorney who had practiced before Judge Blackwood's court. They needed to determine who had been victimized by the corruption and who had been complicit in it. Several prominent law firms found themselves under scrutiny as investigators followed the money trail that connected legal fees to judicial outcomes. Local politicians faced intense pressure to explain how such extensive corruption had gone undetected for so long. County commissioners, city council members, and state representatives all claimed ignorance, but investigators found evidence that some had received warnings about Judge Blackwood's behavior over the years. Complaints had been filed and ignored, rumors had been dismissed, and whistleblowers had been silenced. The jail where Judge Blackwood was being held became a focal point of public attention. Other inmates, many of whom had appeared before him in court, recognized the irony of their former judge now wearing the same orange jumpsuit they had worn. Stories leaked out about how the judge was struggling to adjust to incarceration, reportedly asking for special accommodations and expressing shock that he was being treated like any other prisoner. As the investigation expanded, federal prosecutors began building what they described as an airtight case. They had recordings, financial records, witness testimony, and a clear pattern of criminal behavior stretching back more than a decade. The evidence was so overwhelming that even Judge Blackwood's high-priced defense team was reportedly advising him to consider a plea agreement. The scope of the civil lawsuits that began filing was staggering. Hundreds of former defendants and their families retained attorneys to sue not just Judge Blackwood, but the entire county system that had allowed his corruption to flourish. The potential financial liability was estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars, threatening to bankrupt the county government. Insurance companies that provided coverage for the county's legal liabilities began their own investigations, trying to determine whether the systematic nature of the corruption voided their policies. The financial implications were becoming clearer every day, and county officials were starting to realize that the true cost of Judge Blackwood's crimes would extend far beyond his personal accountability. Officer Thompson continued his regular patrol duties, but his life had changed dramatically. He was receiving death threats from people connected to Judge Blackwood's network, requiring additional security measures. At the same time, he was being hailed as a hero by reform advocates who saw him as the honest cop who had finally exposed a system of corruption that many had suspected, but no one had been able to prove. The federal investigation was revealing connections that reached into neighboring counties and even other states. Judge Blackwood's network had tentacles stretching far beyond what anyone initially imagined. Federal investigators discovered that similar corruption schemes were operating in 3 neighboring counties, all connected through a system of mutual protection and shared profits. Judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials had been trading favors across jurisdictional lines, ensuring that wealthy defendants could literally shop for the most favorable court system. The evidence kept mounting as digital forensics teams analyzed thousands of emails, text messages, and financial transactions. They found encrypted communications between Judge Blackwood and officials in other states, discussing the transfer of high-profile defendants to courts where outcomes could be guaranteed for the right price. What had started as local corruption had evolved into an interstate criminal enterprise. Officer Thompson was called to testify before a federal grand jury, where prosecutors walked him through every detail of that Tuesday night traffic stop. His testimony was crucial because it demonstrated that Judge Blackwood's corruption wasn't limited to his courtroom behavior. The judge had attempted to corrupt a police officer in real time, offering bribes and making threats that revealed the depth of his criminal mindset. The grand jury proceedings were sealed, but word leaked that additional indictments were coming. Court clerks reported unusual activity as federal marshals began serving subpoenas to officials throughout the region. Bank records were seized, computer systems were imaged, and safe deposit boxes were opened under federal warrants. Meanwhile, the civil litigation was gaining momentum at an unprecedented pace. Class action lawsuits were filed representing thousands of defendants who had appeared before Judge Blackwood over his 20-year career. Personal injury attorneys, wrongful conviction specialists, and civil rights lawyers all descended on the county, signing up clients who had been victimized by the corrupt system. One particularly devastating lawsuit was filed by the family of Marcus Rodriguez, a 19-year-old college student who had been sentenced to 15 years in prison for a non-violent drug offense. Court records showed that Judge Blackwood had received a significant payment from a private prison company just days before sentencing Rodriguez to the maximum possible term. The young man had already served 4 years of his sentence before the corruption was exposed. The private prison angle added another layer to the scandal. Investigators discovered that Judge Blackwood had been receiving regular payments from correctional corporations in exchange for ensuring high occupancy rates. His harsh sentences weren't just about individual bribes. They were part of a larger scheme to keep private prisons profitable by guaranteeing a steady stream of inmates. Public defenders who had practiced before Judge Blackwood came forward with stories that painted a picture of systematic bias against defendants who couldn't afford private attorneys. They described how the judge would schedule cases involving wealthy defendants at convenient times while forcing public defender cases into rushed proceedings with inadequate preparation time. The financial audit of Judge Blackwood's personal assets revealed a lifestyle funded entirely by corruption. His salary as a judge was approximately $150,000 per year, but investigators found evidence of expenditures exceeding $2 million annually. Luxury cars, expensive jewelry, private jet travel, and real estate investments had all been funded by bribes and kickbacks. Forensic accountants traced money flows that resembled organized crime operations more than judicial misconduct. Judge Blackwood had been laundering bribery payments through a network of shell companies, consulting agreements, and real estate transactions. The sophistication of the money laundering operation suggested he had professional help from financial advisors who were now facing their own criminal charges. The psychological evaluation ordered by federal prosecutors revealed disturbing insights into Judge Blackwood's mindset. He genuinely believed that his position entitled him to operate above the law, viewing bribery not as corruption, but as appropriate compensation for his judicial services. The evaluation suggested he had developed a sense of grandiosity that made him feel immune from consequences. Victims of Judge Blackwood's corruption began organizing support groups to deal with the trauma of learning that their sentences had been influenced by bribes rather than justice. Families who had struggled to understand why their loved ones received such harsh treatment finally had answers, but those answers brought their own form of pain and anger. The media coverage intensified as investigative journalists uncovered additional layers of the conspiracy. Television documentaries were being planned, book deals were signed, and Officer Thompson found himself fielding requests for interviews from news outlets across the country. He remained focused on his job, but the attention was overwhelming for someone who had simply been doing routine police work. County officials scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal, but the financial implications were becoming impossible to ignore. Bond rating agencies downgraded the county's credit rating, making it more expensive to borrow money for essential services. Property values in the area began declining as potential residents and businesses decided they didn't want to live somewhere with such widespread corruption. The state Supreme Court took the unprecedented step of reviewing every case decided by Judge Blackwood during his tenure. They appointed special masters to examine thousands of verdicts, sentences, and judicial decisions to determine which ones had been influenced by corruption. The review process was expected to take years and cost millions of dollars. Defense attorneys throughout the state began filing appeals for clients who had been sentenced by Judge Blackwood, arguing that the systematic corruption invalidated their convictions. Prosecutors found themselves in the impossible position of trying to defend verdicts that may have been purchased rather than earned through proper legal proceedings. The federal investigation expanded to include the selection and appointment process for judges in the state. Investigators wanted to understand how someone with Judge Blackwood's character had been elevated to the bench, and whether similar problems existed in the vetting system. They discovered that political connections and financial contributions had played inappropriate roles in judicial appointments. Legislative hearings were scheduled to examine the oversight mechanisms that had failed to detect Judge Blackwood's corruption despite numerous warning signs over the years. State lawmakers faced pressure to implement new transparency requirements and accountability measures to prevent similar scandals in the future. Officer Thompson continued receiving protection from law enforcement agencies concerned about retaliation from Judge Blackwood's criminal associates. The threats against him were taken seriously because the investigation had revealed connections to organized crime figures who had benefited from the judge's corrupt rulings. The first settlement negotiations began as county officials realized they faced financial exposure that could bankrupt their government. Insurance companies were refusing to cover claims related to intentional criminal acts, leaving taxpayers responsible for potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in damages. Legal experts were calling it the largest judicial corruption scandal in American history, with implications that would reshape how courts operate throughout the country. The case that started with Officer Thompson's routine traffic stop had exposed systemic problems that demanded fundamental reforms to the justice system. As federal prosecutors prepared for trial, they had assembled what they described as an insurmountable mountain of evidence against Judge Blackwood and his co-conspirators. The recordings from that Tuesday night traffic stop remain the centerpiece of their case, providing a real-time window into how corruption operated at the highest levels of government. The settlement discussions were about to begin in earnest, and the numbers being discussed were staggering enough to shock even experienced attorneys. The preliminary settlement discussions began behind closed doors in the federal courthouse, with mediators attempting to quantify decades of systematic injustice. County attorneys faced an impossible task, trying to calculate damages for hundreds of wrongfully harsh sentences, careers destroyed by corrupt rulings, and families torn apart by a system that sold justice to the highest bidder. The first major breakthrough came when Judge Blackwood's defense team approached federal prosecutors about a cooperation agreement. Facing multiple life sentences under federal racketeering statutes, the disgraced judge finally realized his position couldn't protect him from the consequences of his actions. His attorneys indicated he was willing to provide information about the broader corruption network in exchange for reduced charges. Federal prosecutors were initially skeptical. Judge Blackwood had lied consistently throughout the investigation, attempting to minimize his role and blame others for the systematic corruption. However, the information he offered proved too valuable to ignore. He provided details about corruption schemes in 4 other states, naming judges, prosecutors, and political officials who had participated in similar pay for justice operations. The cooperation agreement required Judge Blackwood to submit to extensive debriefing sessions, surrender all hidden assets, and testify against his former co-conspirators. In exchange, prosecutors agreed to recommend a 25-year federal prison sentence instead of the life terms he originally faced. The agreement also required him to forfeit every asset purchased with corruption proceeds, including his mansion, luxury vehicles, and investment accounts. Meanwhile, the civil settlement negotiations were reaching astronomical figures. County officials received preliminary damage estimates exceeding $400 million, representing compensation for every person who had been victimized by Judge Blackwood's corrupt practices over his 2-decade career. The county's entire annual budget was only $60 million, making it impossible to pay such settlements without federal assistance or bankruptcy protection. Insurance companies that had provided liability coverage for the county government filed their own lawsuits, arguing that systematic criminal activity voided their policies. They claimed the county had failed to properly supervise Judge Blackwood, despite receiving multiple complaints about his behavior over the years. The insurance litigation added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming legal situation. Officer Thompson found himself at the center of settlement discussions as attorneys tried to determine appropriate compensation for the man whose integrity had exposed the entire scandal. Legal experts argued he deserved substantial financial recognition for refusing bribes and maintaining his professional standards, despite pressure from powerful corrupt officials. County officials worried that acknowledging Thompson's heroism might imply they should have known about the corruption earlier. The first individual settlements were announced for victims who had suffered the most egregious treatment under Judge Blackwood's corrupt regime. Marcus Rodriguez, the college student sentenced to 15 years for a non-violent drug offense, received a settlement of $12 million plus immediate release from prison. His family's attorney described the payment as acknowledgement that no amount of money could restore the 4 years of his life stolen by corruption. Private prison companies faced their own legal challenges as investigators revealed the extent of their involvement in Judge Blackwood's scheme. Congressional hearings were scheduled to examine how profit motives had corrupted the justice system, with lawmakers demanding explanations for contracts that essentially paid judges to keep prisons full. Stock prices for correctional corporations plummeted as investors realized the financial exposure from participating in illegal activities. The ripple effects extended throughout the legal profession as bar associations in multiple states launched investigations into attorneys who had practiced before corrupt judges. Some lawyers faced criminal charges for actively participating in bribery schemes, while others lost their licenses for failing to report obvious corruption they had witnessed. Law schools began revising their ethics curricula to address the systematic failures revealed by the investigation. Victims' families organized advocacy groups demanding reforms to prevent similar corruption in the future. They pushed for mandatory body cameras in all judicial proceedings, independent oversight of judicial conduct, and automatic review processes for cases involving unusually harsh sentences. Their efforts gained national attention as politicians recognized the need for comprehensive justice system reforms. Officer Marcus Thompson's routine traffic stop on that Tuesday night proved that integrity and courage can triumph over even the most sophisticated corruption. Judge Blackwood received his 25-year federal sentence, paying back over $50 million in stolen assets, while the county ultimately settled for a staggering $600 million to compensate victims of his criminal enterprise. Thompson was promoted to detective and continues serving his community, knowing that sometimes doing the right thing can change everything. The case stands as a reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, will eventually find those who believe they're above the law. This case was brutal, but this case on the right-hand side is even more insane.